At 08:15 on January 10, 1986, the conditions for a routine dive at Crystal River Nuclear Plant were nominal. 2 commercial divers prepared to descend. The circulating water pumps, designed to move 360,000 gallons per minute, should have been locked out. They weren't. The forensic record shows 2 divers entered. The system ensured they would never exit. Crystal River Unit 3 sits on Florida's Gulf Coast. A pressurized water reactor, commercial operation began March 13, 1977. By 1986, the facility had established a reputation for procedural discipline. On the morning of January 10th, 2 contracted commercial divers arrived to perform maintenance. William Crzevy, John Bown. Both men carried autonomous scuba gear, standard practice for shallow industrial work. The task was routine: clear debris from the 48-inch intake basin pipeline. 0 radiation exposure. Cooling water only. The intake structure draws seawater to cool the plant's non-nuclear systems. 4 massive circulating water pumps cycle water through condensers, then discharge it back to the Gulf. Each pump can move 90,000 gallons per minute. Together, they generate hydraulic force measured in tons per square inch. The dive plan called for confined space entry under 0 visibility, no tethers, no voice communication with the surface. 2 air tanks per diver. Maximum autonomy. The men would descend through an access manhole into turbid water, following a guide rope to the intake mouth, where sediment and organic matter accumulated over months of operation. But one procedural element had failed: Lockout/Tagout, the industrial safety protocol designed to isolate energy sources during maintenance, had not been executed. The pumps were running, not at full capacity, not silent, running. The control room had received the work order. Maintenance scheduling confirmed the dive window, but the energized status of the circulating water system was never communicated to the divers. The pumps cycled water. The intake structure became a hydraulic mechanism, 360,000 gallons per minute, moving through steel pipelines. The pressure differential between the open water and the intake mouth created a gradient invisible to anyone on the surface. At 08:15, William Crzevy entered the water. Surface conditions: calm. Water temperature: 15 degrees Celsius. Visibility: 0. He descended along the guide rope. Standard procedure: his air supply was rated for 45 minutes. He carried no surface-supplied umbilical. The assumption was autonomy. 15 meters of dark water separated him from the intake mouth. His role: standby diver. If Crzevy encountered trouble, Bown would execute a buddy rescue. The protocol was clear. The equipment was tested, but neither man knew the pumps were running. The latent system was already active. The water was not a place, it was a mechanism. And the mechanism was live. William Crzevy descended through the blackness. His breathing regulators functioned normally. No equipment failure. No warning. As he neared the intake mouth, the hydraulic gradient took effect. Differential pressure, delta P, operates on a simple principle. When water accelerates through a constriction, it creates suction force behind the flow. The intake mouth was a 48-inch pipe. 4 pumps pulled 360,000 gallons per minute through it. The pressure drop between ambient water and the intake interior generated force equivalent to several tons per square foot. Crzevy had no time to react. The current seized him, not gradually, instantaneously. His body was pulled into the intake structure with enough velocity to prevent any counter-movement. He entered the pipe. Total darkness. 0 reference points. The pipeline angled downward. His air bubbles could not rise. The flow was too strong. Delta P incidents are forensically simple. The victim is accelerated into a confined space by differential pressure. Escape requires force greater than the hydraulic gradient. A human body cannot generate that force. The physics are absolute. Cřevy's air supply was finite, 45 minutes under normal consumption. But panic accelerates breathing. Struggling accelerates breathing. The timeline compressed. On the surface, the standby team observed his air bubbles stop rising. A normal pattern would show steady exhalation reaching the surface every few seconds. The bubbles ceased. Silence. No distress signal. No voice communication. The system had none. Only the absence of bubbles. The surface team conferred. Crzevy had been under for 8 minutes. No visual contact, no physical feedback through a tether. Because no tether existed, the decision matrix collapsed to a single option: send the standby diver. But the root cause had not been identified. The pumps were still running. The intake structure remained a hydraulic trap. The pressure differential had not changed, and the standby team did not know. The lethal concentration of force inside the pipeline was invisible. The water looked calm. The manhole was quiet, but beneath the surface, 360,000 gallons per minute continued to cycle. The mechanism waited. John Bown prepared to enter the water. His training was identical to Cřevy's. His equipment was identical. His objective, locate his partner and execute a buddy rescue. The decision to send him was driven by urgency. A diver was missing. The protocol demanded a response, but the protocol assumed the work environment was controlled. It assumed the energy sources were isolated. It assumed Lockout/Tagout had been executed. None of those assumptions were correct, but the surface team did not know. The control room had not been contacted, the pump status had not been verified, the dive supervisor operated on incomplete information, a procedural lapse at one level cascaded into a life or death decision at another. Bown entered the water at 08:27, 12 minutes after Cřevy descended. He followed the same guide rope, same depth, same zero visibility. His breathing was steady, he carried the same air reserve, 45 minutes. As he descended, he searched the water column. No contact, no physical feedback. He continued toward the intake mouth. The hydraulic gradient began to affect him. First, a pull. Then acceleration. Then loss of control. John Bown was drawn into the intake structure. The same mechanism, the same physics, the same irreversible outcome. His body entered the pipe. The flow carried him deeper into the confined space. No light, no orientation. His hands struck steel. His regulator remained functional, but escape was impossible. The differential pressure held him in place. Forward movement only. The pipe angled, turned, constricted. On the surface, the second set of bubbles stopped. At 08:31, the dive supervisor contacted the control room. 2 divers were missing. The surface team could not explain the pattern. The site coordinator reviewed the work order, then checked the system status. The circulating water pumps were running. Full cycle, 360,000 gallons per minute. The realization was immediate. The work site was not isolated. The intake structure was energized. The divers had entered a live hydraulic system. The order went out. Emergency shutdown. All 4 circulating water pumps, immediate de-energization, but the order took time to execute. The pumps could not be stopped instantly. The system had to be ramped down. Coolant flow had to be verified through alternate pathways. The reactor protection systems had to confirm safe thermal margins. Nuclear protocol required sequential shutdown, not emergency trips that could destabilize the reactor. Minutes passed. The pumps spun down, the hydraulic force inside the intake structure decreased, the flow slowed, then stopped. The water inside the pipeline became still. By 08:43, the system was de-energized. 28 minutes after Cřevy entered the water. 16 minutes after Bown followed him. The surface team prepared for recovery operations. The intake structure was now safe. The differential pressure was eliminated. But the damage was finalized. Recovery divers entered the water at 09:15. Surface supplied air. Voice communication. Tethered. The system had been triple verified as de-energized. The intake structure was now a static environment. The first diver descended through the access manhole. The guide rope was intact. The water remained turbid, but the hydraulic current was gone. He entered the intake pipe. William Crzevy was located 32 meters inside the pipeline. His body had been pressed against an interior baffle where the pipe diameter reduced. His scuba regulator was still in his mouth. His air tanks were empty. Time of death, estimated between 08:20 and 08:25. He had survived inside the pipe for approximately 7 to 12 minutes after entrapment. John Bown was found 18 meters inside the same pipeline. His position suggested he had attempted to reverse course after entering the intake mouth, but the hydraulic gradient prevented backward movement. His air supply was also depleted. Time of death, estimated between 08:35 and 08:40. He had remained conscious inside the confined space for at least 8 minutes after losing mobility. The forensic record is unambiguous. Both men died of asphyxiation due to air supply depletion while trapped in a hydraulic confinement. Neither man drowned, neither man suffered crush injury. They died in darkness, unable to move, waiting for their air to run out. The bodies were recovered and transferred to the surface by 09:53. The site was secured, the intake structure was inspected, no equipment malfunction, no structural failure, the pipeline functioned as designed. The pumps functioned as designed. The deaths were not caused by mechanical defect. They were caused by procedural failure. OSHA Inspection 1015-86980 was opened the same day. Federal investigators arrived on site within hours. The site coordinator provided documentation, the work order, the dive plan, the system status logs, the communication records. The OSHA investigative team identified the root cause within 48 hours. Lockout/tagout procedures had not been executed. The circulating water pumps were never isolated from their energy source. The worksite was never verified as de-energized. The dive team was never informed of the hazard. The second finding was equally critical. The standby rescue protocol had no mechanism to halt operations and verify site safety before sending a second diver. The rescue attempt replicated the initial failure, systemic collapse. The control room delay in shutting down the pumps was documented but not classified as negligence. Nuclear reactor protocols required sequential shutdown to prevent thermal transients. The control room followed procedure, but the procedure assumed adequate communication between operations and maintenance. That assumption was false. The final OSHA report concluded the deaths were preventable, the hazard was foreseeable, the procedural lapse was identifiable, and the corrective actions were clear. The Crystal River Unit 3 incident became a case study in industrial diving safety. The forensic record was studied by OSHA, the NRC, and commercial diving oversight bodies across the United States. Lockout/tagout, the protocol designed to prevent exactly this failure, had existed for decades, but enforcement was inconsistent. Documentation was loose. Verification was often assumed rather than confirmed. The Crystal River incident demonstrated the lethal consequences of procedural drift inside high-consequences environments. Within 18 months, OSHA revised its confined space entry standards. New requirements mandated energy isolation verification before any maintenance work inside pressurized or hydraulic systems. The revision cited Crystal River explicitly. The two divers' names appeared in the regulatory text as the direct cause of the update. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued parallel guidance. All commercial nuclear plants in the United States were required to adopt enhanced lockout/tagout protocols for non-radiological maintenance. The guidance banned autonomous scuba diving in intake structures, cooling systems in any confined space where differential pressure or flow hazards existed. Surface-supplied air systems became mandatory. Voice communication became mandatory. Tethered operations became mandatory. By 1990, the commercial diving industry had adopted the Crystal River lessons as baseline standard. Autonomous scuba was restricted to open water operations only. Confined space work required umbilical supply, real-time monitoring, and continuous communication. The era of silent, untethered dives inside industrial infrastructure effectively ended. The changes did not resurrect William Crzevy or John Bown, but the forensic record shows their deaths directly prevented subsequent fatalities. Between 1986 and 2010, no similar differential pressure entrapment occurred at any US nuclear facility. The systemic correction was absolute. Crystal River Unit 3 itself continued operation until 2013, when structural issues in the containment building forced permanent shutdown. The plant entered SAF store, long-term monitored storage, and will eventually be dismantled. The circulating water pumps were decommissioned. The pipeline where 2 men died is now dry. The OSHA file remains open as a reference case. Inspection 10158S6980 is cited in federal training programs for industrial safety officers. The photographs from the recovery operation are restricted, but the procedural documentation is public record. The forensic analysis is taught in confined space rescue courses. William Crzevy and John Bown were experienced divers. They followed their training. They trusted their equipment. They entered a worksite that appeared controlled. The failure was not theirs. The failure was systemic. Their deaths were not an accident. They were the conclusion of a procedural lapse inside a high-consequence system. The forensic record is clear. The regulatory correction is documented. And the lesson remains: in environments where invisible forces operate at lethal scale, procedure is not a guideline. It is the only mechanism that stands between routine work and irreversible tragedy. If investigations like this one matter to you, subscribe to Forensic Protocol, because the systems we trust are only as safe as the procedures we enforce.